Welcome to our second class in language comprehension and cognitive neuroscience of language. I got to give you a little background on this situation for me. This was really interesting for me. Language is speech and language is reading. And my master's and dissertation were kind of in the field of speech and reading. And so I'm going to kind of get to take a little bit of a trip with you down memory lane here for just a few minutes as we kind of cover some of the history of this. And then towards the end of the class, we'll get into the kind of the cognitive neuroscience of things. So we'll start off with the cognitive realm. What would be the cognitive realm of reading? What would be the cognitive realm of reading? If you were a cognitive psychologist and you were studying reading, what would you study? Okay, seeing no answers from the group, why don't you go to the agenda for Module 2, Class 2, and we would study the cognitive processes for reading. So why don't you go ahead and read that sentence for me. Daisha, could you read the sentence I actually have on the board there for the class? Under Roman numeral 1, how do we read? What does it say up there?
I decided to go to the store to get some roses for my girlfriend.
To get some roses, what did you say at the end there at first?
For my girlfriend.
What does it actually say up there?
From my girlfriend.
So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think that was a typo on my part? Actually, it was, but I decided to keep it in there. So a cognitive psychologist would talk about what goes on mentally while you're doing that, and you were actually doing some of the processes there. What would a cognitive neuroscience do with reading processes? What would a cognitive neuroscience do? Lily, Hannah, any thoughts on what a cognitive neuroscience would do when it comes to reading? Lily's kind of staring at you, hoping you'll say something here.
Yeah, I know. No, I really don't. I woke up 10 minutes ago. My brain isn't working yet.
Okay, that happens to me as well. Can anybody help out? If you're in the field of cognitive neuroscience, you wouldn't just study the mental processing of things, but what would you do? Brittany, what would you do?
Like measure brain activity?
Yeah, you'd kind of look and see if there's brain activity and what is going on in the brain when you're reading and processing things. You might even get into dysfunctional reading, which would be what field that some of us know about. If you're not able to read the right way or can't read at all, what is that called?
Dyslexia.
Dyslexia. So you might get into that realm as well. So what I wanted to do with you here is I wanted to actually start with the sentence there and some of the processes going on there. Now, the mistake made, you said for my girlfriend. That was the intent when I typed it up, but I actually did a little typo here. Could you actually predict that mistake? So you may want to write down, how could you actually predict that mistake? Bella, how could you predict that mistake?
Well, the sentence would make sense to my brain if it said for, because, you would go to the roses as a romantic gesture to buy roses for your girlfriend.
So the idea of for, so you get a lot of context-dependent information from the sentence, so there's context going on there. And in what way is that? Is that top down? Is that bottom up, would you say?
I'd say bottom up.
Well, you might say bottom up, but
I'd say top.
Oh, yeah.
it would be top down. Why would we say top down? Make sure I pronounce it right. Say it again for me. Taliban. I think I said it right that time. Taliban. Yeah, there we go. What would you say? Why would you probably argue for more top down going on there?
Because since our brains already know what the sentence is supposed to look like, it kind of completes the whole entire thing, and it doesn't go into detail. If it
So the top down processing, exactly the case of the sentence, feeds down and tells you the bottom up. You're not really paying attention to that. You're kind of predicting what that item is going to be, so it would fill into that. What else has to happen for you to read and comprehend that. So are there any other processes that have to happen, maybe more at a micro level, in order to read this? Pretend you're dyslexic or not. But what do you have to do in order to actually, you were talking about a nice gesture and an intent, which you can kind of pick up if you read and understand. But what else has to go on here? At more of a micro level. If the lights are off, what won't happen? Transduction won't happen, so the information has to get up to your brain first. We're not going to talk about that so much here, but when that information gets up into your brain, how about your eyes? What do your eyes have to do here? What kind of processing has to go on with the eyes and mentally here to allow this to occur? Kate, any thoughts from your end about this?
Well, I mean, your eyes have to focus on each word so you can read each word.
Yeah, your eyes have to focus on each word, and then besides focusing on each word, what do they have to do after looking at a word? You look at one word, and then what do your eyes have to do?
Shift.
They have to move. Does anybody know what we call that kind of movement? Those are called, if you want to write for your notes, saccades. I think it's actually a French word. Does anybody know French? Kind of. Lily, do you know a little French? Do you know what saccades mean? And basically, it's an eye movement. Your eyes have to move from step to step, kind of process this, and then what else do you have to do here? So you have to look at each item. When it gets up into your mind, what must you do? These are just symbols. What must you do with these symbols at a cognitive level? Do you use your mental lexicon at all? You have to figure out, have I used that term before here? Your mental, let's put that term down, your mental lexicon. Your lexicon, Lexicon, these are all the words up in your mind. You have a vast dictionary up in your mind. What do you have to do with these symbols in your mind?
You have to, well, you have to be able to recognize them.
Yeah, recognize them, and you have to have memorial processes, right? You have to understand what each individual word means. And we did the word frequency situation. That was accessing your mental lexicon. High frequency words are quickly processed. Low frequency words are not. Chronometric analysis, but it is of your lexicon. So you have to do that. You have to figure out each individual word, right? So your eyes are moving. You have to understand the words. And then what else do you have to do here? So you go from word to word, but what were you able to all do by the end of this? Say again?
Read the sentence.
Read the sentence, but not only read the sentence, but there's another level of things as well. So you were able to read the sentence.
And comprehend.
Comprehension. So comprehension must happen as well. So you're able to look at the items. Now the word we use to understand what those words mean, going into your mental lexicon, during the encoding process, we call understanding words lexical access. You have to access your lexicon, figure out what these words mean. How is this process, for maybe the final point here, are we good at doing this for speech? Hello, what is your name?
My name is Bella.
So was that pretty easy for you to do? And what do speech people say about that kind of processing? That it's what? Kind of quick, and is it pretty automatic mostly?
Yeah.
So it's kind of an automatic thing. This process of reading, how is it? Is this a simple gig? Lily, would you say that this is all very simple and, just like I'm talking to you right now, that reading works under the same rules, that it's very simple and quick and easy to pick up?
I would say for us it seems like it because we don't really think about it while we're doing it.
We don't really think of it while we're doing it, but when we're learning speech versus, so developmentally, when we're learning speech versus learning reading, which one of those is more difficult?
Reading.
The reading, why?
You have to learn it in so many different ways, like with the phonemes and with everything else, and you have to build up to that point of reading.
You have to, it's a very learned process. So you could argue, once again, speech is kind of automatic, and reading is much more of a learned behavior. It's much more of a learned behavior. Some of the facts we know, so does this make sense to people? So it's a much more difficult process, reading, and that's why we have people who have dyslexia, because this has to be learned, and there could be neurobiological reasons why it isn't learned. There could be just cognitive reasons why it isn't learned. So the facts that we know, let me share with you some of this information. We said when your eyes are moving, what is those movements called from point to point? Say again? Saccades. We make saccades. We have to have we have to use our mental lexicon. We have to have lexical access, figure out what they mean, integrate, comprehend. So that's what we basically know. Does this make sense to people then? The other thing that I'll basically share with you is kind of a fact before we get into some of these articles and information. If you look at number 3 there, the paraphobia. So when we're looking at words straight on, where do they fall on our eyes? What part of the retina do they actually fall on when you're looking directly at a word? The fovea. So when you're staring right at a word, it's the fovea that you're using. But as it turns out, while your eyes are staring at the information that you're looking at, what are you eventually going to do after you look at that item? You're going to make a what? Madison, what are you going to eventually make after you look at that item? So you look at an item and then your eyes do what?
They move on.
They move on. And what is that called once again? They make a saccade. So as it turns out, while you're staring at point A in your fovea, able to read the words and the letters in there, you actually, it turns out, one of the facts we know, you get a paraphobia preview. While you're staring at point A on the outside portion of your eyes, you're getting a paraphobia preview. So you're kind of unconsciously almost processing, how would that be useful? Will that tell you where to move your eyes on the saccade? Yeah, so we know that there's a paraphobia preview. One of the things that we used many years ago, still used now, but probably much more reliable as a computer and so forth, is an eye tracker. And one of the instruments we use is called an eye tracker that can actually watch and see just what your eyes are doing. It's called an eye tracker. See where you're looking, where you move your eyes to, how long you spend on each individual spot. Now, for some of you, when you read that sentence, was there a spot that you probably had a longer saccade for or a longer fixation point? What item? The word from probably caused a little bit of longer fixation time. So from probably caused longer fixation. So an eye tracker can measure that. Does that make sense to everybody here in the class? Okay, so that's kind of the first ditty here. Let's see, we've been going for, need the glasses. About 14 minutes here. That'll stop recording number 1.